September 1944, a liberated village near Reims, France. Mud-splattered American tanks sit idling along a narrow stone street, their engines filling the cool autumn air with a low, heavy rumble. Tired soldiers sit on the fenders, wiping grease from their hands and chewing on stale rations. Suddenly, the quiet space between the armored vehicles changes. A military policeman steps forward, his hand raised aggressively to halt a tiny figure approaching from the shadow of a ruined bakery. A young girl is walking directly toward the command car, holding a fragile piece of paper. The guard barks a stern warning, ordering her to stay back from the military convoy. From the back seat of the staff car, a pair of sharp eyes locks onto the scene. A cold, commanding voice overrides the guard, ensuring the child is allowed to walk forward. This is the story of what Patton carried in his wallet for 15 months. A simple crayon drawing from a 6-year-old French girl that outlasted the war itself. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We tell the World War II stories that show humanity in the darkest places, bringing you the hidden moments of compassion that history books often leave behind. Sophie Renard was 6 years old. She lived in a small stone house with a damaged slate roof on the edge of the village near Reims. For 4 long years, her world had been defined by silence, fear, and the heavy boots of occupying soldiers. Her mother had kept her hidden indoors, away from the windows, and away from the main road where the gray supply trucks rolled by day after day. When the American armor finally arrived, shaking the very foundations of her bedroom floor, her mother wept with relief and whispered that the liberators had finally come to save them. Sophie did not know what a general was, nor did she understand the massive mechanism of global war. She only knew that the men in the olive-green uniforms had brought smiles back to her mother's face. Armed with a single piece of lined notebook paper and a box of worn crayons, she sat at her small wooden kitchen table for 3 hours, carefully drawing a large green vehicle with a bright red, white, and blue flag pinned to the top. Next to the machine, she placed a simple stick figure with an oversized smile, pressing down hard on the black crayon to print the single word her mother had taught her, mercy. With the paper folded tightly in her small hand, she walked out into the bright September sunlight, determined to find the very first soldier she could see. General George S. Patton Jr. sat in the rear of his open-top command car, his fingers tapping impatiently against the leather seat. He was 58 years old, a man molded by decades of rigid military discipline and the absolute pursuit of total victory. His uniform was immaculate, untouched by the thick mud that coated every tank in his spearhead division. On his belt rested his famous ivory-handled revolvers, symbols of an uncompromising authority that demanded perfection from every officer and private under his command. He did not view the European theater through the lens of individual emotion, but rather as a vast, moving chessboard of fuel logistics, ammunition tonnage, and rapid tactical advances. To Patton, a village was a grid coordinate to be cleared, a bridgehead to be secured, and a stepping stone toward the heart of Germany. His mind was currently fixed on the map, spread across his knees, calculating the exact distance to the next German defensive line and cursing the fuel shortages that threatened to slow his momentum. He had no time for ceremony, no patience for delays, and no expectation that his morning drive through a broken French town would offer anything more than another stretch of ruined asphalt. By September of 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe had reached a critical, exhausting pace. The rapid breakout from the Normandy beachheads had carried the Third Army hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, liberating vast swathes of the French countryside and pushing the German forces into a frantic, chaotic retreat toward their own borders. This explosive momentum, however, came at a massive material cost. Supply lines were stretched to the absolute breaking point, with fuel trucks struggling to keep pace, with the armored spearheads that devoured thousands of gallons of gasoline every single hour. In many small towns and villages along the path of advance, local populations were caught in a strange, suspended animation between the sudden departure of the occupying garrison and the arrival of the frontline combat units. Chaos was the standard of the day. Military police struggled to maintain order on roads choked with retreating enemy forces, advancing armor, and thousands of displaced civilians attempting to return to what was left of their homes. Under the immense pressure of this logistical nightmare, many field commanders routinely ignored the civilian populations they encountered. There was simply no time to stop, no rations to spare, and no energy available for sentimental interactions. The war machine demanded constant movement, and standard military protocol dictated that local populations be kept clear of active combat lanes for their own safety and the efficiency of the advance. Most officers viewed the crowded village squares as a hazardous bottleneck to be cleared as quickly as possible with shouts and waving hands. The human element of liberation was frequently buried beneath the urgent, cold demands of the daily operational maps. Yet, as the armor ground to a temporary halt in the narrow streets near Reims, the rigid barriers of military necessity were about to collide with a small, folded piece of paper. The young girl stood 10 feet from the idling command car, her small leather shoes caked in gray mud. She held the folded piece of paper out before her, like a shield against the wall of heavy machinery and armed men. Corporal David Miller, 24, from Allentown, serving with the 503rd Military Police Battalion, stepped directly into her path with his right hand firmly raised. "Get back to the sidewalk, little girl," Miller said. The child froze, but did not lower her arm, her eyes wide as she looked past the soldier at the massive olive-green vehicles. She spoke no English, and the soldier spoke no French, creating an immediate, silent wall between them in the middle of the narrow street. "Move along home now. It is not safe for you to be wandering around these vehicles," Miller said. The girl took one slow step forward, holding the drawing closer to the corporal's uniform, her fingers trembling against the edge of the notebook paper. "Look, kid, I do not care what you have there. You need to clear the roadway right now," Miller said. The corporal reached out his gloved hand to gently but firmly grasp her shoulder, intending to guide her back toward the stone buildings, where a few local villagers watched from the doorways with anxious faces. "No, please. Let her pass through," a voice called out from the front seat of the staff car. Captain Louis Girard, 31, a Free French liaison officer attached to the 3rd Army headquarters, leaned over the metal side of the vehicle, waving his hand toward the security detail. "The general wants to see what she is holding," Girard said. Corporal Miller stopped instantly, his hand dropping from the girl's shoulder as he turned his head toward the back seat, where 4 silver stars caught the autumn light. He stepped backward, clearing the path between the 6-year-old child and the rear door of the command vehicle, his posture straightening into a rigid stance. "Bring her over here," the captain said. The little girl did not look at the military policeman again, her eyes fixed entirely on the large man in the back seat who sat perfectly still among the maps and leather. She walked forward with slow, deliberate steps until she stood directly beside the metal door of the car, extending her hand to offer the folded notebook paper. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton looked down at the child standing beside his muddy wheel. He reached out and took the folded paper from her small hand, his leather gloves making a sharp scratching sound against the rough notebook sheets. He opened it slowly, unfolding each corner with deliberate care. His eyes scanned the crayon lines, tracking the green tank, the red flag, and the bold black letters spelling out the single word of gratitude. He did not pass it to an aide, and he did not cast it aside to return to his tactical positions. He stared at the drawing for 20 seconds, his face completely rigid, studying the child's crayon strokes with the same intense focus he usually reserved for his standard operational maps. "Did you draw this for us?" Patton asked. The little girl looked up into his face and nodded her head once, her small fingers gripping the edge of her wool coat. "Captain, tell this young lady that this is the most accurate and valuable intelligence report my headquarters has received all week," Patton said. Captain Girard translated the words into French, his voice soft against the low rumble of the idling tank engines nearby. Sophie did not understand what an intelligence report meant, but she watched the hard lines around the general's mouth soften into a brief, rare smile. Tell her that we will keep this with us as we move toward the border," Patton said. The general folded the paper back into its original square, creasing the edges firmly with his thumb. He did not place the drawing into his uniform pocket or slide it into the leather dispatch case filled with combat orders. He reached inside his jacket, pulled out his worn leather wallet, and carefully slid the crayon drawing into the center slot directly next to the photographs of his wife and daughters. He closed the wallet and buttoned his jacket. "Thank you, young lady. I intend to keep this right here," Patton said. He looked forward at the road ahead, his hand signaling the driver to engage the gears. The engine roared, the large tires gripped the wet gravel, and the command car began to move forward through the square. Sophie stood on the muddy stone curb, watching the stars on the bumper disappear into the dust of the moving column. The general's order was carried out immediately before the entire assembled column of the 3rd Army spearhead. Corporal Miller stood at absolute attention, his white-gloved hand cutting a sharp silhouette against the gray stone walls of the village as he saluted the departing command car. Every soldier sitting on the muddy fenders of the idling tanks watched the exchange in absolute silence, the usual rough jokes and complaints of the frontline troops vanishing completely. The local villagers, who had been watching anxiously from behind their cracked wooden doors, began to step out onto the narrow sidewalks, their faces changing as they realized what had just occurred between the American commander and the young girl. A low murmur of voices drifted through the cool autumn air as mothers wrapped their shawls tighter around their shoulders, and old men nodded slowly from the steps of the bakery. Sophie stood perfectly still on the cobblestones, the smell of heavy diesel exhaust and wet earth swirling around her as the massive convoy began to grind forward once again. The heavy steel tracks of the Sherman tanks clattered loudly against the stone street, shaking the ground beneath her feet as the division resumed its relentless march toward the eastern horizon. Sophie Renard went on to live a quiet, peaceful life in the rebuilt village near Reims, eventually marrying a local tradesman and raising 3 children of her own before passing away in the winter of 1998. She never forgot the giant, dust-covered man in the back of the olive-green command car, who had accepted her small token with the gravity of a supreme commander. Corporal David Miller returned home to Allentown in January of 1946, working 40 years as a machinist at the local steel mill, and frequently telling his grandchildren about the morning the 3rd Army stopped moving just for a piece of notebook paper. He died quietly in his sleep in the autumn of 1989, leaving behind a collection of wartime photographs that always sat next to his old military police helmet. General George S. Patton Jr. never spoke of the encounter to the press, and he never made mention of the French girl in his official operational reports to Supreme Headquarters. Yet, when his personal effects were gathered from the military hospital in Heidelberg, following his tragic death in December of 1945, the small leather wallet was found inside his uniform jacket. Nestled directly beside the worn black and white photographs of his beloved family was the neatly folded square of notebook paper, its crayon lines still vibrant, carrying the crude green tank and the single word of gratitude across 15 months of brutal combat. Some historians argue that General Patton's highly publicized displays of emotion and connection with civilians were calculated maneuvers designed to polish his public image and soften his reputation as an unyielding, ruthless taskmaster. They suggest that a multi-starred commander, stopping an entire military column for a child's crayon drawing, was an idealized event exaggerated by contemporary wartime media to construct a more sympathetic narrative around a deeply controversial figure. Other historians argue the exact opposite, pointing out that Patton was a man of intense, hidden sentimentality who deeply understood the heavy human cost of the conflict he directed. They believe his decision to carry the folded notebook paper through months of brutal winter combat was an authentic gesture of personal devotion. What is certain is that the small piece of lined paper survived the war inside his leather wallet, remaining a durable, physical testament to an unexpected moment of warmth that the vast machine of global destruction could not erase. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have simply folded the paper and forgotten it in the rush of a historic military advance? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories about humanity in the darkest places, make sure to subscribe.